It was a day like any other when Mia, a quiet artist who preferred the company of her paintbrushes to the outside world, looked out her window and saw something that would forever change her life. A small cat, drenched from the rain, was standing there, eyes wide with a look that seemed to carry the weight of an untold story. Something in those eyes stopped Mia in her tracks. A silent plea for help. Without a second thought, Mia opened the door, stepped into the rain, and scooped up the tiny creature in her arms. Little did she know, this moment was the beginning of something much larger, something that would touch the lives of strangers and change the world they knew. Mia had always lived a quiet, solitary life. Her apartment, nestled on the edge of town, was her sanctuary, where she could paint and lose herself in the world she created on canvas. But despite her passion for art, Mia often felt disconnected. She hadn't realized how lonely she was until the small, wet cat found its way into her life. She named it Clover, a name that seemed to fit the fragile creature perfectly. When Mia brought Clover inside, the little cat trembled in her arms, unsure of her new surroundings. But as Mia set her down, something miraculous happened. Clover didn't run or hide like most stray animals would. Instead, she simply curled up on the couch beside Mia, purring softly. Mia smiled and, for the first time in a long while, felt a warmth she hadn't known she was missing. Over the next few days, Mia found herself growing closer to Clover. The little cat would follow her around the apartment, sitting beside her as she painted. Sometimes, Clover would nudge her hand, as if encouraging her to keep going. The connection between them was simple yet profound. Mia didn't have to say anything, and Clover didn't ask for much, just a bit of love and care. In the evenings, after Mia finished her work, Clover would curl up on her lap while she read or watched TV. The quiet companionship was enough. Mia hadn't realized how much she craved this kind of relationship until she had it. For the first time in years, she didn't feel so alone. Clover, with her soft purring and gentle presence, had filled a space in Mia's heart that she hadn't even known was empty. But little did Mia know, this was just the beginning of Clover's impact. What started as a small, quiet companionship would soon ripple outward, touching the lives of others in ways no one could have predicted. One afternoon, as Mia sat by the window, absorbed in a painting she was working on, Clover wandered out of the apartment. At first, Mia didn't think much of it. After all, Clover had started to explore the world outside. But as the hours passed and the sun began to set, a knot tightened in Mia's stomach. Clover hadn't returned. The house felt strangely empty without her soft footsteps and purring presence. Mia walked to the door, calling for her little companion, but there was no response. Panic began to seep into her chest. Where could she have gone? Mia whispered to herself. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She stepped outside, the evening air biting at her skin as she searched the streets, but Clover was nowhere to be found. As the minutes stretched into hours, Mia's heart grew heavy with worry. Her mind raced with thoughts of what might have happened to the little cat. What if she's lost or hurt? She thought, struggling to hold back tears. The loneliness that had once seemed bearable now felt suffocating. She needed Clover back. It wasn't until late that evening, when Mia's phone rang, that her hope was reignited. On the other end of the line was Daniel, a man who lived just a few houses down the street. "I think I've found your cat," he said, his voice calm but filled with an undeniable warmth. Relief washed over Mia as she scrambled to gather her things. "Where is she?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of anxiety and hope. "She's on my porch," Daniel replied. "Been here for hours. She's just sitting there, like she's waiting for you." Mia didn't waste another second. She hurried down the street, her legs moving faster than they ever had before, desperate to see Clover again. When she arrived at Daniel's porch, her heart nearly stopped. There, sitting patiently, was Clover, her little body soaked from the rain, her eyes wide and shining. And yet, there was something serene about her, as if she knew everything was going to be okay. As Mia knelt down and scooped Clover into her arms, a rush of emotions overwhelmed her. But this moment was more than just a reunion. It was the beginning of something deeper. As Mia looked up at Daniel, who had patiently waited with Clover, their eyes met. It was as though an invisible thread had connected them, and in that moment, Mia realized that this small, fragile cat had not only returned to her, but had brought her to someone else. Daniel, a retired firefighter who had been living with his own grief, saw in Clover something he hadn't expected: a lifeline. The cat had brought them together. Two strangers who had both been searching for something they couldn't name. As Mia and Daniel shared a quiet smile, something shifted in the air between them. It wasn't just a cat they were talking about anymore. It was the beginning of a bond neither had anticipated. Clover, with her quiet presence, had somehow mended the broken parts of their hearts, showing them that life. As days turned into weeks, the bond between Mia, Daniel, and Clover deepened in ways neither could have imagined. What had begun as a chance meeting, a simple rescue of a small cat, had blossomed into something more. Clover's presence had healed a part of both Mia and Daniel that they hadn't realized needed mending. But there was more to Clover's journey than just offering comfort to Mia and Daniel. The little cat, with her gentle spirit and unspoken wisdom, had a way of bringing people together in ways they never expected. One afternoon, after Clover had been spending more time outside again, she wandered into a small community garden where Rosa, an elderly woman in her 70s, had spent years nurturing her plants. Rosa, who had lived alone since the death of her son many years ago, had learned to find solace in her garden. But even the colorful blooms and fragrant flowers couldn't fill the ache in her heart. The loneliness weighed heavily on her. Clover, ever curious, ventured into Rosa's garden one late afternoon, drawn to the soft rustle of leaves and the inviting scents of the flowers. At first, Rosa didn't notice the little cat that had appeared by her side, contentedly rolling in the grass. But as Rosa bent down to tend to her flowers, she caught sight of Clover and smiled. There was something about the cat that made her heart flutter in a way she hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't just the softness of Clover's fur or her innocent purring. It was the quiet companionship the cat offered. Rosa, for the first time in a long time, didn't feel so alone. Every day after that, Clover would return to the garden, curling up in Rosa's lap as she worked, or simply sitting nearby, watching the world go by. Rosa began to talk to Clover, telling her stories of her son, of her late husband, and of the life she had once shared with them. Clover listened with the patience only a cat could offer. There was no judgment, no rush for her to speak back, just a silent understanding, an unspoken connection. For Rosa, it was as if the cat had reached deep into her heart and helped her begin to heal old wounds she had kept buried for too long. But it wasn't just the three of them anymore. As Clover's visits became more frequent, she began to form connections with others in the neighborhood. One day, as Daniel walked by Rosa's garden, he paused to see the elderly woman and the small cat sitting together. Something stirred within him, a gentle reminder of how far he'd come since his wife's death. It wasn't easy, this living with loss, but seeing Rosa find comfort in Clover's presence reminded him that life could still offer moments of peace, even in the wake of grief. Daniel, who had once kept to himself, now found himself stopping by the garden to check in on Rosa and Clover. He'd sit on the bench beside her, sharing a quiet conversation about the weather, the garden, and life. In those moments, he realized that Clover had become more than just a cat to him. She was a catalyst for change, for healing, for reconnecting with the world he had almost given up on. Mia, too, found herself drawn to the growing community that Clover had built. She visited Rosa's garden often, bringing along her paints and sketchbooks, capturing the beauty of the small, peaceful space. Each time she arrived, she was greeted by Clover's familiar purr, and the sight of Rosa, Daniel, and the cat together filled her heart with a quiet joy. For Mia, Clover had become a reminder that even in the most unexpected of places, there was always the potential for connection and love. But it wasn't just about finding companionship. Clover had unknowingly brought a sense of hope back into their lives. With each passing day as she visited Rosa, Daniel, and Mia, it became clearer that this little cat had unknowingly begun to change the lives of those around her in ways they never expected. She was more than just a stray cat who wandered into Mia's life one rainy day. She had become a bridge between the past and the present, between loneliness and healing, between people who had once been strangers but were now connected by something greater than themselves. The changes that Clover had sparked weren't confined to just Mia, Daniel, and Rosa. Her gentle, unassuming presence began to ripple through the entire neighborhood, slowly weaving an invisible thread between people who had once lived separate lives. As the weeks passed, the bond that Clover had formed with each person deepened, transforming not just their individual lives, but the entire community. It was almost as though Clover had unknowingly become a symbol of hope, a living reminder that no matter how broken or distant a person might feel, there was always a way back to connection. One particularly cold evening, as Mia sat by the window, her thoughts drifting as they often did, she noticed something unusual: a knock on the door. When she opened it, she was surprised to see her neighbor Sarah standing there, a shy smile on her face. Sarah, a young woman who had recently moved to the neighborhood, had always kept to herself. She seemed distant, always in a rush, as if carrying the weight of something unspoken. But that evening, she stood at Mia's doorstep, her eyes searching for something. A sign, perhaps, that she could be part of something. I heard about Clover," Sarah said softly, glancing down at the little cat who was resting on Mia's windowsill. "And I was wondering if maybe I could spend some time with her." Mia blinked, surprised. Sarah had never approached her before, let alone asked to spend time with Clover. It was clear that something had shifted, something that had drawn Sarah out of her shell. Mia smiled warmly, stepping aside to let her in. "Of course," she said, her voice full of kindness. "Clover's been a gift to all of us." The moment Sarah sat down next to Clover, the little cat seemed to sense her unease. She curled up beside her, purring softly, as if to reassure her that she was safe. Sarah's stiff posture relaxed, and for the first time in months, her shoulders dropped with a sigh of relief. She hadn't realized just how much she had been craving connection, how deeply the loneliness had been eating at her. She had moved here seeking a fresh start, but the weight of her past had followed her, and she hadn't known how to shed it. But Clover, with her gentle eyes and quiet demeanor, had a way of drawing the pain out, of easing the weight of unspoken sorrow. Sarah sat with Clover for hours that evening, speaking of her childhood, of the dreams she had left behind, of the things she wished she could forget. And Clover listened. That's all she ever did. Listen and offer her companionship without question or judgment. As Sarah left later that night, she felt lighter, as though the heavy fog that had clouded her heart had started to lift. She realized that in a world full of noise and haste, sometimes the quietest moments held the greatest healing power. And Clover had given her that, the ability to be still, to be present, and to allow herself to feel, without fear of being judged. The next morning, Sarah returned, this time with a small gift, a bouquet of fresh flowers for Rosa's garden. It wasn't much, but it was her way of saying thank you, of showing her gratitude for the connection Clover had helped her rediscover. She offered them to Rosa with a quiet smile, and the two women sat together in the garden, the flowers between them acting as a symbol of new beginnings, of hope. As Mia, Daniel, Rosa, and Sarah all began to share more time together, the bond between them grew stronger. The small acts of kindness, the silent exchanges, the moments of vulnerability shared between these once strangers all began to heal the cracks in their hearts. They started to realize that while they might not be able to fix everything in their lives, they could lean on one another and share the weight of their stories. But amidst all the healing, there was still one question that lingered in the air. How had Clover, a small, stray cat, become the catalyst for this change? How had she managed to bring so many people together, to heal so many hearts? The answer, though, wasn't something that could be easily explained. Perhaps it was simply the power of love and connection, of an animal who, without knowing it, had shown everyone around her that the world could still be kind, still be full of possibilities, and still offer unexpected moments of grace. As the days stretched on, the once quiet neighborhood began to feel like a different place. It was as if Clover's presence had breathed new life into the community, uniting people who had once lived their lives in isolation. The cat had become a symbol of something much bigger than herself, a reminder that healing could come from the most unexpected sources. People who had kept their heads down, too absorbed in their own struggles, now found themselves stopping to say hello, to share a smile, or even to sit for a moment with one another. It wasn't just Clover's sweetness that made her so remarkable. It was her ability to connect people in a way that no one had expected. Mia, now more open to the world than she had ever been, started reaching out to her neighbors, inviting them over for tea or a chat in her living room. What surprised her the most was how these once distant neighbors had begun to find comfort in one another. They didn't have to say much. Just sitting together, sharing stories about their lives, their losses, and their hopes, had begun to form a quiet but powerful bond. At the center of it all was Clover, who seemed to act as the glue that held them together. She never pushed, never demanded attention. She simply existed, offering her love freely and without reservation. One afternoon, as Mia sat outside with Daniel and Rosa, Clover came to sit beside them, purring contentedly in the sunlight. The peacefulness of the moment struck Mia deeply. She had spent so many years locked in her own world, painting in solitude, unsure of how to reach out to others. But here, with these people, she realized she was part of something far bigger than herself. She wasn't just an artist anymore. She was a person who had learned the value of human connection, of opening her heart to those around her. And Clover had played a pivotal role in teaching her that lesson. It wasn't just the cat's presence that mattered. It was the way she had brought the community together, making everyone feel seen, heard, and loved. Then, one fateful evening, a storm rolled in. The rain fell in sheets, the wind howled through the trees, and the sky darkened with the kind of fury that only nature could unleash. Mia, Daniel, Rosa, and Sarah gathered together in Mia's apartment, the windows rattling in the wind. They had all grown so close over the past months, and in that moment, they found solace in each other's company. But just as the storm reached its peak, a sharp knock at the door broke through the tension. Mia opened it to find Sarah, drenched from the rain, holding Clover in her arms. She's not moving," Sarah said, her voice shaking. The sight of Clover limp in her arms sent a wave of panic through Mia. "What happened? Where did you find her?" Mia asked urgently. Sarah's face was pale. "I don't know. She was outside during the storm. I went looking for her when I couldn't find her inside. She just collapsed." The room fell silent. A terrible, painful weight settled over the group. Clover, the little cat who had brought so much joy and healing to their lives, lay motionless in Sarah's arms. Mia, shaking, took Clover into her own arms, her heart breaking. It felt like the world had stopped. They had all grown so used to Clover's gentle presence that the thought of losing her seemed impossible. But in that moment, something incredible happened. As Mia held Clover, she looked around at the faces of the people who had come together through this small, quiet cat. Their pain was real, but so was their gratitude. They had learned from Clover how to love, how to share, how to be there for one another. And even if the worst had happened, they knew that the connections they had formed wouldn't go away. Clover had given them more than just love. She had given them a family, a bond that couldn't be broken, no matter what came next. In the days that followed, Clover's health slowly began to improve. It turned out the little cat had simply been exhausted, overwhelmed by the storm and the weight of the emotions she had carried for so long. It was a reminder that even when things seemed at their worst, there was always hope. And just as she had always done, Clover made her way back into their lives, stronger than ever. The storm had passed, and so had the fear. As they sat together, watching Clover sleep peacefully on the couch, they realized that no matter what life had in store, they had found something truly extraordinary. They had found each other. And through it all, they would never be alone again. The weeks that followed Clover's near miss with the storm were marked by a profound sense of gratitude. It wasn't just the relief that she had survived, it was the way her presence had become a silent promise to everyone around her. A promise that, no matter how much life tested them, there was always the possibility of healing, of hope. Mia, Daniel, Rosa, Sarah, and the others had found something they didn't even know they were missing. A sense of belonging, a family not bound by blood, but by love, shared experiences, and the unspoken connection they had all found through the little cat. One evening, as Mia painted by her window, she paused to look at Clover, who had curled up on the windowsill basking in the soft glow of the evening light. A peaceful smile crossed Mia's face. But there was something more. Something deep inside her had changed. The woman who had once been so closed off, so guarded, had come to realize how much Clover had transformed her life. And it wasn't just about the connection with others. It was about the way Clover had taught her to open her heart, to be vulnerable, to truly live. But just as Mia was starting to feel like she had finally found her place in the world, something unexpected happened. One evening, Daniel called her in a panic. He had been walking Clover around the block when the cat suddenly bolted out of his arms, running into the street without warning. "Mia, I don't know what happened," Daniel said, his voice shaky. "She ran so fast, I couldn't catch her." Mia's heart dropped. She immediately grabbed her coat and rushed out of the apartment. The familiar panic washed over her, the fear of losing Clover again, the fear of the unknown. She could feel the weight of her own vulnerability, the worry that she might never get the chance to say goodbye if the worst happened. As she reached the street, she saw Daniel standing by the sidewalk, his face etched with worry. But just as she approached, she saw Clover, sitting on the steps of a nearby house, her tail flicking gently, completely unharmed. The relief that flooded through Mia was so overwhelming she almost couldn't breathe. Clover had simply run off into the night, driven by some unknown impulse, and yet she had found her way home. It was a small moment, a simple thing. But it struck Mia with an undeniable force. She realized in that instant that Clover's journey was not unlike their own. Life didn't always make sense. It didn't always follow a neat path, a straight line. Sometimes you ran in fear, you bolted, not knowing where you were headed. But eventually, you found your way back. You always found your way back. Later that evening, as Mia sat with Clover curled up in her lap, she thought about how much the cat had given her, not just in companionship, but in a deeper, more profound way. Clover had taught her that even in the chaos of life, there was always the potential for a soft landing, for love and forgiveness to bloom, even after moments of loss. It was a lesson that Mia had needed to learn, and it was a lesson she would carry with her for the rest of her life. Daniel, too, had been deeply affected by the night's events. As he sat beside Mia, he turned to her with a quiet smile. "You know," he said, "I never thought a connection like this again. But Clover, she's brought something into my life that I didn't even know I needed." Mia nodded, her heart full. "Me too," she whispered. "She's changed everything." They both looked down at Clover, who was now sound asleep between them, a symbol of resilience, of hope, and of the quiet power of connection. And so the journey continued, not just for Clover, but for all of them. They had found their way back together. No longer alone, no longer separate. They had discovered that the greatest gift in life was not in what you could take, but in what you could give, and in what you could share. Clover had brought them back to life, to each other, and to a love that would continue to grow, long after the quiet days had passed and the storms had faded. As the months went by, life in the neighborhood began to feel like a quiet rhythm. The bond between Mia, Daniel, Rosa, Sarah, and the others was now inseparable. They had all come to rely on each other in ways they never expected. Their gatherings, once infrequent and filled with awkward silences, were now filled with laughter, shared stories, and moments of deep, heartfelt connection. But it wasn't just the people who had changed. It was the entire community. The little neighborhood, once distant and disconnected, now thrived with a spirit of togetherness. And at the center of it all was Clover, the little cat who had quietly transformed their lives. One evening, as Mia sat on her balcony, looking out over the streets she had once felt so disconnected from, she reflected on how much had shifted. The people who had once passed each other without a word now waved, smiled, and stopped to chat. The streets were no longer just streets. They were a place where people looked out for one another, where they shared both the weight of their burdens and the joy of their triumphs. And it all started with Clover. Mia couldn't help but smile as she thought about how far she had come. She had once been a woman so lost in her own grief, so closed off to the world, that she had no idea what it meant to truly connect with others. But now, she knew. She had learned the value of vulnerability, of allowing yourself to trust others, of opening your heart to the possibility of love and loss. And it was Clover who had shown her the way. It was the little cat who had brought everyone together, who had helped her see that life was not meant to be lived alone. But just as life had begun to feel like it was settling into something resembling normalcy, another challenge arose, one that would test the strength of the bonds they had formed. One chilly autumn morning when the air was crisp and the leaves had begun to fall, Daniel received unexpected news. His job, the one he had relied on for so many years, was being downsized. The company was restructuring, and his position was being eliminated. The weight of the news hit Daniel hard. His mind raced with thoughts of how he would support himself, how he would make ends meet. The fear, the uncertainty, the overwhelming sense of loss, it all came crashing down. But even in the midst of the storm, he didn't feel alone. He knew that no matter what, he had a community that would stand by him. And as soon as he told Mia, Rosa, and the others, they rallied around him with unwavering support. The days that followed were filled with both sadness and determination. While Daniel worked to find new opportunities, Mia, Rosa, Sarah, and the others made sure he knew he wasn't facing this battle alone. They spent evenings together, brainstorming ideas, offering encouragement, and simply being there for him. It was in those moments of shared vulnerability that the true depth of their connection became clear. The bonds they had formed weren't just based on shared moments of joy. They were also built on shared moments of struggle, of facing life's challenges together, and knowing that no matter how tough things got, they would always have each other. One evening, as the group gathered at Rosa's garden to celebrate the harvest of her vegetables, Daniel arrived with a look of quiet relief on his face. He had secured a new job, one that promised a fresh start, a chance to rebuild. The group erupted in applause, celebrating not just his new opportunity, but the strength of the friendship they had all forged. It was a victory not just for Daniel, but for them all. As they sat together, Clover curled up contentedly at the center of the circle. The group reflected on how much they had learned from her. The cat had shown them the importance of resilience, of never giving up, of trusting in the process, even when the path ahead seemed uncertain. Clover had taught them that there was always hope, even in the darkest moments, and that no challenge was too great when faced with love and support. As Mia looked around at the faces of her friends, she realized just how much had changed. She had once been someone who believed she was beyond help, beyond healing. But Clover had shown her that healing was always possible, that love could mend even the deepest wounds. And in turn, she had shared that lesson with everyone around her. Together, they had learned that even in the face of life's hardest moments, there was always the possibility of finding a way back to hope, back to connection, and back to love. In that moment, Mia knew that Clover's impact had gone far beyond what anyone could have imagined. The little cat had not just changed their lives, she had changed the world around them. And as they all sat there, under the golden light of the setting sun, they realized that this was just the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with endless possibilities. The days turned into months, and the seasons slowly shifted from the crisp autumn to the chilly winds of winter. But through it all, one thing remained constant: the strength of the bond Clover had woven among them all. The cat's presence was no longer just a comfort, it had become a foundation. The small, fragile creature who had once wandered the streets, uncertain and alone, was now the center of a community that had grown together in ways none of them had anticipated. Mia, now deeply attuned to the importance of these relationships, had become a quiet pillar in the lives of her neighbors. She found herself organizing community dinners, encouraging everyone to come together, not just for special occasions, but simply to share a meal, to share stories, and to be together. It was as though Clover had shown her the power of living for others, of giving without expecting anything in return. And Mia, in turn, had learned to give more freely, more generously, knowing that the more love you give, the more love you receive. One chilly December evening, the community gathered once again, this time to celebrate the holiday season. The streets were lined with twinkling lights, the scent of freshly baked pies and warm bread wafting through the air, and the laughter of friends and families filled the streets. Clover, now an honorary member of every family, wandered between groups, receiving endless pets and strokes from her adoring neighbors. She was, as always, the heart of the gathering, the quiet, unassuming cat who had brought them all together in ways words could never explain. As Mia and Daniel worked together in the kitchen, preparing the food for the evening's feast, they found themselves reflecting on the journey that had led them to this point. Daniel had settled into his new job, and while it wasn't the path he had imagined, it had opened new doors, doors he never would have considered before. He felt more at peace with his choices, more confident in himself. He had grown, not just as a person, but as part of a community. He had learned that it was okay to lean on others, to accept help when needed, and to be vulnerable enough to admit when things weren't going as planned. It was something he had struggled with before, but Clover had shown him that strength didn't come from standing alone, it came from standing together. Rosa and Sarah, too, had found their lives transformed by the little cat. Sarah, who had always been a loner, had slowly come out of her shell, finding comfort in her newfound friendships. Rosa, who had been so focused on her garden, had started to take more time for herself, enjoying the simple pleasure of a cup of tea with a friend or the quiet peace of a good conversation. Both women had begun to appreciate the beauty of connection, and, in turn, they had helped create an environment where others felt safe to connect as well. The small acts of kindness, the moments of shared joy, had rippled out into the world around them. But as the evening wore on, and the community gathered around the fire, laughing and sharing stories, something unexpected happened. It was the kind of moment that would forever be etched in their hearts, a moment that would stay with them long after the holiday season had passed. As they sat there, Clover wandered to the edge of the yard, stopping to look at something in the distance. For a moment, she seemed as though she was simply enjoying the quiet of the night, her tail flicking gently in the breeze. But then, she began to walk toward the corner of the street, her steps slow but purposeful. Mia, noticing the direction Clover was heading, stood up, calling out to her. "Where are you going, little one?" she asked, but Clover didn't turn back. A few moments later, Daniel stood up, his face drawn with concern. "I think she's going to the park," he said, and without another word, the two of them quickly followed Clover. When they reached the park, they found her sitting by a bench, staring out at the snow-covered trees. But it wasn't the park that drew their attention. It was the figure sitting on the bench, a man who appeared to be homeless, wrapped in a thick, worn blanket, his face hidden by the hood of his jacket. Clover, as if recognizing something they didn't, walked straight up to him, rubbing against his legs. The man looked down, startled at first, but then, as he saw Clover's gentle face, his expression softened. Slowly, he reached down and stroked her, a tear sliding down his cheek. "I didn't think anyone would notice me," he whispered, more to himself than to anyone else. Mia and Daniel stood there in silence, a quiet understanding passing between them. In that moment, they realized something incredibly profound. Clover's gift wasn't just about healing wounds or connecting people who already knew each other. It was about seeing the unseen, about showing love to those who felt invisible. In a world that often passed by the unnoticed and the forgotten, Clover had shown them the power of simply being present, of extending a hand or a paw to someone in need. And in doing so, she had taught them a lesson they would carry with them for the rest of their lives, that every soul deserves to be seen, every heart deserves to be heard. They didn't say anything to the man. There was no need for words. They simply stood together, Clover at their feet, as the man stroked her fur. And for that one beautiful moment, they all shared in the silent understanding that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do for someone is just to show up, to be there, and to offer the simple gift of companionship. The months passed, and as the world outside shifted from the harsh chill of winter to the soft renewal of spring, the neighborhood began to bloom in ways it never had before. The flowers weren't the only things that had grown. So had the connections between the people who lived there. The quiet beauty of the shared moments, the everyday kindnesses, had taken root in their hearts, and now they flourished like the first blossoms of the season. And Clover, who had been at the center of it all, continued to move through their lives with the same quiet grace she had always had, reminding them that even the smallest among us can have the greatest impact. Mia, who had once lived a life of solitude and silent struggle, now found herself reaching out more, not just to her neighbors, but to strangers. The lessons Clover had taught her about love and vulnerability had opened her eyes to the beauty of the world around her. The potential for connection in every moment. Her heart, once closed off and guarded, was now a wellspring of warmth and generosity. She spent her days volunteering at local shelters, helping organize community events, and even reaching out to those who had once been invisible to her. The elderly couple down the block who no one ever seemed to talk to, the young woman struggling with her own grief, the man who always sat alone in the park. The transformation in Mia was profound. She had become not just a survivor, but a healer, passing forward the kindness that Clover had brought into her life. And as she gave, she received in return. The people around her, her neighbors, her friends, were now as much a part of her story as she was of theirs. She wasn't just a woman who lived alone anymore. She was part of something bigger, part of a community that saw her, understood her, and cared for her. And through that, she had learned that sometimes the most unexpected sources of change come in the smallest packages. But even as Mia thrived, even as she built this new life for herself, there were moments when she felt the sharp sting of doubt. There were days when she wondered if she could keep this newfound strength, these new connections, alive. Was she really enough? Could the love they had built together, the bonds they had forged, truly last? It was on one of those quiet days of self-reflection that Mia found herself sitting by the window, watching Clover as she basked in the sunlight. The cat, as always, looked so peaceful, so content, and yet there was something in her that seemed to radiate a quiet strength, a strength Mia had come to depend on. It wasn't just the way Clover had been there for her in moments of darkness, or the way she had silently comforted those around her. It was something deeper, something unspoken. Clover had shown her that true strength wasn't about being unbreakable. It was about being open, being vulnerable, and allowing yourself to lean on others when you needed it most. It was then that Mia realized something that had eluded her for so long. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about showing up, about loving even when you weren't sure how things would turn out. It was about trusting in the process, in the people around you, and in yourself. It was about accepting the fact that sometimes life would be messy. But that didn't mean it wasn't worth living or worth loving. In that moment, she understood the full extent of what Clover had taught her, not just through the cat's actions, but through her very existence. Clover had shown her the beauty of embracing imperfection, of finding strength in vulnerability, and of trusting that love was never a weakness, but a strength beyond measure. And as Mia sat there, watching Clover stretch lazily in the sunlight, she felt a quiet peace wash over her. She knew now, more than ever, that she was enough, that she was worthy of the love she had found, and that love was what would continue to carry her through every challenge life threw her way. Meanwhile, Daniel had found his footing again as well. His new job, though not exactly what he had dreamed of, had proven to be a blessing. He had found a sense of purpose in it, a renewed sense of self-worth. But more than that, he had found a deeper sense of belonging in the community they had built together. The people around him were not just colleagues or neighbors. They were his family, his support system. He had learned, through the love of his friends and through Clover, that real success wasn't just about career achievements or financial stability. It was about the relationships you nurtured, the love you gave, and the way you lifted each other up when life became heavy. One evening, as they all gathered for a quiet dinner at Rose's house, Daniel raised a glass. "To Clover," he said, his voice filled with gratitude, "for showing us all what it means to truly live, to truly love." Everyone raised their glasses, and even Clover, sitting at the center of the table, seemed to understand. The room was filled with smiles, laughter, and a warmth that could only come from the deepest of connections. And as Mia looked around the room, her heart swelled with pride. She had come so far, and so had everyone else. They had all grown together, healed together, and loved together. And it was all because of the small, resilient cat who had shown them that the most powerful thing in life is love. The kind of love that doesn't ask for anything in return. The kind of love that simply exists, quietly and steadfastly, through every storm and every season. As spring began to bloom in full, the world outside seemed to echo the transformation that had taken place within the hearts of Mia, Daniel, and the others. They had become a family, bound not by blood, but by shared experiences, love, and the lessons Clover had so gently imparted to them. But even as they thrived, the inevitable truth began to settle in. Clover, though forever etched in their lives, was aging. At first it was subtle, slower movements, a few more naps in the afternoon. But soon it became more apparent. Clover no longer had the same spring in her step, and her once vibrant eyes now seemed tired. Mia noticed it first. One morning, as she watched Clover lying quietly on the windowsill, her heart squeezed with an emotion she couldn't quite name. Fear, grief, it was all wrapped up in one. The fear of losing the one being who had given them all so much, and the grief that had been brewing beneath the surface for months. The following days were filled with quiet moments of reflection, of gratitude, and of the unspoken understanding that time was running out. But Clover never seemed to let on. She continued to show up for everyone in her own way, curling up next to Sarah as she read, rubbing against Daniel's legs after a long day of work, and finding the perfect spot in Mia's lap whenever she needed comfort. The cat was not just a part of their lives, she was their heart. And as the days went on, they all did their best to savor every moment, every small act of kindness, and every word spoken with love. One summer evening, as the sun began to set and the streets glowed with a warm golden light, the community gathered once more, this time for an evening of reflection. The garden in Rosa's backyard was filled with flowers that had bloomed under her care, and the laughter of children echoed in the distance. The air was thick with memories, both joyful and bittersweet. As they sat together, Clover, now a little slower than before, made her way to the center of the gathering. The familiar purr that had always been so comforting to Mia, now softer, more fragile. Everyone looked at her, and for a moment, no one spoke. They simply watched, grateful for the presence of this small being who had changed their lives in ways they could never fully explain. And then, as if understanding the weight of the moment, Mia spoke. Her voice was steady, but the emotion was clear. "We've all learned so much from this little cat," she said, looking around at the faces of her friends. "Clover taught us what it means to truly love, to open our hearts and be vulnerable. She taught us that it's okay to fall apart sometimes, as long as we have people who care to help us pick up the pieces." Tears filled Daniel's eyes as he nodded. "And she taught us the power of community," he added softly. "That no matter what happens, we're stronger together. She's shown us that love doesn't have to be big or grand. It's the small moments, the everyday things that mean the most." Sarah, her voice thick with emotion, looked down at Clover and smiled. "She gave us the gift of seeing each other, really seeing each other. And in doing so, she helped us find something we didn't even know we were looking for." The group fell silent for a moment, each person lost in their thoughts. Clover, seemingly aware of the weight of their words, nestled contentedly in the center of the circle. Though her body had slowed, her spirit was as bright as ever. And in that moment, Mia realized that the true gift of Clover was not just in her presence, but in the way she had forever altered their lives. In the weeks that followed, Clover's health began to decline further, but her presence remained as powerful as ever. She remained the heart of the community, always a reminder of the strength and beauty of love, no matter how small or fragile. Then one quiet evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the stars began to appear, Clover passed away peacefully, surrounded by the people who loved her. There were no dramatic goodbyes, no grand speeches, just the soft, peaceful transition of a soul who had lived a life full of meaning and had given so much to others. The grief that followed was profound, but it was not a grief of despair. It was a grief that spoke of love, of deep, unwavering connection, and of the space that Clover had left behind, a space that would never truly be filled, but one that would continue to resonate with the lessons she had taught them. She had shown them the power of vulnerability, the beauty of love, and the importance of standing together. Clover had changed them all, and in doing so, she had changed the world they lived in. And as Mia sat in the quiet of her home, reflecting on the years that had passed, she realized that the most precious gift Clover had left behind wasn't just the love they had shared, but the way she had taught them all to love more deeply, to live more fully, and to cherish the small moments, the moments that, in the end, made all the difference. As the final tear fell from Mia's eye, she whispered softly, "Thank you, Clover. You were everything." And in the stillness of the room, it felt as though the cat spirit lingered, not in the way of shadows or memories, but in the hearts of everyone she had touched. Because love, once given, never truly fades. It lives on, woven into every story, every smile, and every quiet moment shared between those who are brave enough to love.